year based on how much water is needed. But I think an interesting way to look at this is, how do you do something where you have, you give companies or residences an energy budget based on you could either do the size of their house or specific to the industry. If they go over the energy that you've created a baseline for, they then get charged at a higher fee. And then those who don't use their budget are obviously paying lower. One of the other things that we were looking at is how we wanted to try to see what's the average energy usage per sector, and those who are above average end up paying. Unfortunately, we weren't able to find any of the data on that. That was our hardest part in trying to make some of the decisions that we did, is that just the information on people's energy use isn't out there.
And I guess that's part of the long term, is finding either a way, whether it's yet again another task force or some way to, there's some communities that are obvious just by zip codes, seeing breaking out their usage. I mean, when you think of some communities that have multiple generations in one family, they're going to have different usages. And I think those demographics are going to start to show themselves in the different zip codes. Now, while there's no one zip code that's just one demographic, I think there's definitely concentration. So somehow there needs to be some sort of tracking. Otherwise, there'll be no reason to be held accountable, because we won't have a way to measure it, which means people will be left out. So it's a burden to a certain extent, but I think it's going to be, it's going to be required at some point, or we're just going to keep pushing forward and people will suffer dearly. And it'll just be a select few. And it'll eventually just show up, like I said, via the zip codes.
If I could build on that a little bit, Lori, one of the first things that popped in my head here was kind of the issue of kind of leakage, right? I mean, depending on how we sort of point source or sort of target a particular segment or sector, as we've talked about, I think we've seen historically from consumer behavior, they're just going to go to the cheaper alternative. So take a gas tax, for example. I mean, if you implement a gas tax in Denver, people are going to drive to Arvada, they're going to drive to other jurisdictions perhaps and do the same thing, which has kind of a net negative effect. The other thing I just want to put on the table, since I got the floor, is jumping back to the escalation. I think, when Waxman, Markey, Terry Boxer, and, you don't need to debate cap and trade versus a carbon tax, but I think generally there was a sense that however you price and escalated things, you needed to make sure it was subject to periodic review. And that typically, I think for both programs, the concept was you'd ramp up the price kind of gradually to avoid some of the equity issues we've talked about, accelerate it, and then level it off. You wouldn't accelerate it in perpetuity. Otherwise, you would crater it and a lot of people would suffer. So some sort of control mechanisms for that, I think it would be a good idea to look at that. And
I don't want to create too much of a sidebar, because we can go down this.
No, it's important. I mean, I think it is. I mean, leakage is. I've thought a lot about leakage as we've talked, and I think my main point is we have to be careful to make sure that we don't just contribute to the problem by forcing people to go to other jurisdictions because we've priced them out or something or the like.
I want to address that. So, that's one of the things that I hear people say in the water world too, is you got to have water prices low or people are going to move to different places. I personally think that argument is baloney. If you look at the fastest growing county in the country for a long time, it's Douglas County. Douglas County has some of the highest water prices in Colorado. People aren't looking at energy costs or water costs when they're deciding where to live.
I think the difference for me is really just the nature of the resource, Thomas. I mean, comparing water to air is kind of in this context is just like apples and oranges. I hear what you're saying, but I think there's a lot of differences here just in terms of how people consume the resource, what it does for their home. and the like. So I do think there's a distinction.
I will respectfully disagree.
Let's turn to the final question for the group. Would you all recommend moving this funding option forward as a recommendation of the task force? I think we clearly need a lot more info on taxing levels, but is it something you'd recommend continuing to explore?
So this is Peep. I would recommend moving it forward. I mean, I think one of the things I've been thinking about is with respect to how this impacts low-income communities, how incredibly difficult it is. So Tyler mentioned it's difficult to administer from the business perspective, but also just understanding a little bit more about how, if you are low income, you always have to opt into these programs, and there's a gazillion of them, and you're expected to have a computer and know about them, and like that's asking a lot from somebody who's already dealing with some, very tough circumstances. So I feel like paired with this, we would have to have an effort to figure out an easier way to identify those folks that government steps up on, so that there's less of a burden on the opt-in on the individual. And so I don't know what all the programs are, but if we were able to amass them and say we have all of these opt-in low-income programs and somehow centralize that and take the lead on it as a city and reach out versus expecting people to reach in, I would feel a lot better about this.
And I think to that point, and it may already exist, and if it does, my apologies, is just having a department that specifically has expertise and ways of doing research globally to come up with solutions to enforce that equity is always a part of all of these solutions. Because I think if we just ask people to think about it and not have any biases, it's easy to say that, but there's no way to hold people accountable. And somehow there needs to be a constant every day, someone's keeping an eye out for protecting these communities and low income and creating resources, like you said, we're reaching out and they're not having to reach in. And that may be one of the results that come out of all of this, is that just to keep it at the forefront, it has to be more than just a line item, but an actual design mechanism for it to continuously be something that's implemented in each phase of budgeting and everything else that is done, all the initiatives as well. It's like solving world peace, I know, but somehow it has to be more than just be mindful, but very strategic.
Well, it reminds me a little bit, I mean, I think it was Grace Rink who made the suggestion that we need to be thinking about things like expanding broadband access so that everybody has access to internet in order to allow for low income communities to even know about some of the programs. And so I have that in the back of my
And
mind.
similar to what's happening with COVID-19, we're starting to see ways in which people are identifying those vulnerable communities and creating mechanisms to help them. Like you said, the schools have found ways to overnight provide access to computers and food sources. So I think we need something similarly done in this scenario when it comes to these taxes as well.
Great. Does anyone have we're going to get kicked out in a moment. Any final thoughts? Yeah, Tyler, I know you have a different perspective there.
Yeah, you're not going to get me on record on saying that this should be moved forward to the city council or the mayor's office. But I want to add in that it's so similar to the Resilient Denver ballot initiative that's already on the ballot that we would have to figure out something. We don't want two completely similar ballot initiatives, so I think that should be considered as well. And
Agreed.
just in the whole scheme of things right now, we should think from a political standpoint, what are the odds that any tax revenues are going to be passed in November at this point with the state of the economy? And so we should keep that in mind, because this might be the only bite of the apple that we get for addressing climate change. And if it goes down in November, this could be it for a while. So just throwing that in there.
Yeah, I agree. You have to capitalize on this window.
Very fair.
Any other final thoughts? I'm just capturing the thoughts. And does anyone want to be the person that reports out if we were asked to do that for our room?
I think, Katrina, you're the most objective person in the room.
Yeah, and I would phrase it differently. You wrote down, yes, move it forward. And I think our answer is don't take it off yet.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I-
Continue researching.
With three
Yeah, well,
Mute.